In my last two videos on the secondaries application process, I gave you the 101 on the secondaries, share with you guys some of the things that are not often talked about when it comes to secondaries, and share with you the ultimate spreadsheet to keep you organized during the secondary application process. In this third installment of the secondary application mini-series, I'm going to give you guys writing tips to help you master the secondaries. Number 1, answer the prompts in all parts of it. This might sound super obvious, but when you're writing this many essays, you get exhausted. And when that happens, all the essays just start to blend together. Schools will have different ways of phrasing things or specific things that they want you to focus on. So it's very important to edit and tailor your response to the specific school, even if you already have a similar one written for another school. To give you guys an example, here are two very similar prompts, but they have slightly different focus, and I want to point them out to you guys. So from the University of Vermont, they ask, please reflect on a difficult and challenging non-academic experience you have faced. Include a description of the stressful event, how you dealt with it, and what you have learned about others and yourself through this process. And then, similarly, from the University of Illinois, describe a stressful situation you have experienced. Please detail your reaction, how you managed the situation, and what you learned that will help you handle a similar circumstance in the future. So, the main difference is that in the University of Vermont, they ask you to reflect on a non-academic experience specifically. And then they also want you to focus on what you've learned about others and yourself through this experience. Whereas the University of Illinois is asking, how will that experience help you to handle a similar circumstance in the future? Although they are both asking about a stressful event or a challenging situation, they have very different focus. So you want to make sure that you are addressing those specific questions. Number 2. Prioritize impact over length. Now, each question you are going to have a word limit. Don't feel pressured to max out the word count if you don't need it. Number 3, complement over repeat. You can reuse experiences that you've already talked about in your primary application, but focus on it in a different way and tell it from a different angle. Let's take my experience as a CNA, for example. Here are the different angles I can approach it from. Number 1, working as a part of a dynamic healthcare team. This is going to demonstrate my understanding and appreciation of the various roles in healthcare and how to best utilize them when I am providing patient care. Number 2, I can focus on my work with the elderly population. This is going to show that I can work with individuals from various backgrounds as well as navigating the challenges that comes with that group. And in this case, that's age. And number 3, I can talk about the initiatives that I took while I was a CNA. So things like working to increase efficiency in the workflow or working to reduce overflow medication to save my residents money. This is really going to demonstrate the leadership and the initiatives that I took while I was in my role. Depending on what I want to communicate, the story that I tell is going to be different. So even though I'm talking about the same experience, I can provide multiple perspectives because each experience is multi-layered and three-dimensional. Something that I have found to be helpful in this process is to see what areas you were lacking or you weren't able to communicate through your primary application and using that as a guide to help you decide which perspective you want to approach it from. Number 4. Along that same vein, really try to think outside of the box, beyond the traditional narrative or the typical way of thinking about that topic. So here I have an example for you. The University of Washington School of Medicine asks, how have societal inequities in the US affected you or the patients you have worked with? So my hunch is that in answering this question, most applicants are going to talk about racism, sexism, or income inequality at a high level because these are often the things that come to our mind when we think about social inequities. Now, there's nothing wrong with choosing to talk about these things, especially if you have a really strong anecdote to support it, but I would really encourage you guys to think about other forms of social inequities, and if you have experienced it, utilize this chance to talk about it. For example, I worked with the elderly population as a CNA, so I used this opportunity to talk about ageism in healthcare. Just to give you guys an idea, here are the number of other things that you could talk about in answering this question. Feel free to pause the video to read them. Approaching essays in this way will really help to differentiate you from the other applicants because it shows that you are a critical thinker and are deeply analyzing the world around you. Adcoms are reading thousands of these types of essays per day, so by thinking about the topic beyond the traditional narrative will allow you to really catch the attention of the adcoms. This also applies to diversity essays. Again, it's not just about ethnicity, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic status. It's also about diversity of thought and experiences. I will go into more depth about the diversity essay in part 4 of my mini-series. There I will take a deep dive into the common themed essay questions and how to approach them. So please subscribe and turn on the notification button to be notified when that video comes out. Number 5, don't be afraid to get creative. I know in this med school application process it can seem very uptight and you have to be professional, but when the opportunity presents itself, take advantage of it. When done right, it can provide a breath of fresh air for the AdComs who are reading this, and it can really make you stand out for the right reasons. So I had the opportunity to do this in my superhero essays as well as my describe yourself essay, where I took a more poetic approach. Now, I do want to caution, if you are not much of a creative writer or you don't feel comfortable with it, I would avoid taking this approach because you don't want this to be your first time giving a shot at it. Number 6, let's talk about editors. With the sheer amount of essays that you are writing, I don't think it's feasible to have an editor take a look at all of your essays. However, I do recommend having someone take a look at the essays for your top choice schools, for the super common themed essay questions, or for the essays that you are really unsure about. Now, what I mean by essays where you are unsure about, I mean essays where you might be talking about sensitive or controversial topics. Now, phrasing is everything when it comes to this, so you want to have someone take a look at it to make sure you are not raising any red flags. My overall recommendation for this part is to have 1 to 2 honest, reliable reviewers to take a look at these types of essays, and if possible, also try to have someone who can edit strictly for grammar. Last and finally, tip number 7. If you are having trouble brainstorming or coming up with stories to talk about, try talking to a friend or someone who doesn't really know your experiences or your stories and have them ask you questions about it. This will help to prompt ideas and stories that you can mention, because when you are living that experience, things can start to blend together and you can overlook your accomplishments or areas where you demonstrated strength. So in the brainstorming process, I found it to be really helpful to just have someone to talk to and bounce ideas off of. Another thing that's helpful in the brainstorming process is to understand the goals of each essay. Always ask yourself, what do they want to know by asking me this question, and then work backwards from there. And finally, like I mentioned earlier, go through your primary application to see which areas you are lacking or things that you weren't able to demonstrate to help you narrow down the things that you want to focus on. And that wraps up the secondary essay writing tips. If you have any questions or additional writing tips that you want to share with others, leave it in the comment section down below. As always, best wishes, warmest regards. Until next time, bye!